What's up, guys? Welcome back to Rod Building Basics. Today we're talking about epoxy over your guide wraps. Stick around. Okay, epoxy is pretty simple. Everyone I've ever seen has been a 1-to-1 ratio. As long as you're careful with your measurements and you mix it slow so you don't put a lot of air pockets in it, everything should go well. So here's how I do it. I do it this way every time, and I almost never have a problem with my epoxy. So I have my 2-part epoxy, I have a mixing cup, I have my syringes for pulling exact quantities, I have a stirring stick, I have paper plate with aluminum foil wrapped on it, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And then I have a fancy schmancy little aluminum foil cup that you can buy at most rod building suppliers. So most important part of epoxy work is mixing exactly 1-to-1. Storing your epoxy, I recommend you store it in an area that's 70-ish degrees. I keep it here in the rod shop. I keep the rod shop controlled. I have my syringes marked, black cap, black syringe, white cap, no marks on the syringe. I'm going to use my syringe. I'm going to pull 3 milliliters. Now, I nearly always pull 3 milliliters of each. What I'm going to do, I'm going to let the air bubbles rise to the top, tap it a couple times, and then I'm going to pull 3 milliliters with this syringe and epoxy, and it's pulling a little bit of air. There's 3. Okay, wipe the tip. Put the cap back on it. Move your syringe away so you don't get your syringes mixed up. Done that before. Epoxy cures in your syringe is toast. And get part B lid off. There we go. Take my black syringe in the top. Wait for the air bubbles to release. I'm going to pull 3 milliliters of part B. And there's 3. Put it in my mixing cup, and now my clock starts. I got 3 minutes of mixing. And you want to do it with a stir stick. You want to do it slowly. It's going to turn opaque as soon as you start to mix. And then when you start losing the streaks is when it's going to be thoroughly mixed, but you need to mix it for about 3 minutes. At the end of the last video, I had just put on the CPX color preserver and single part urethane finish on my thread wraps. And while I had the shop door open and the air conditioner going and the fan blowing, trying to get rid of the fumes, I took my sander here, it's a little block sander, and I hit the areas where we had done the marbling in a few videos ago, just to get rid of any little rough parts. It's been about a week since I did that, and I wanted to rough it up a little bit. I am going to put another coat of clear over that. Another warning about the CPX, though, is do not do this in the house unless you like sleeping on the couch. The fumes are horrible. You need to do it in the garage. You need to do it outside. You don't have to worry about dust too much because it's so thin. It soaks right up into the threads and it cures in a few minutes, and you don't have to worry about dust particles getting stuck in it. So don't use it inside, for real. My 3 minutes are just about up. The epoxy's looking good. It's got a few air bubbles in it. But if you use one of these, so this is the paper plate with the aluminum foil on it. This will do 2 things. One, it's going to lay the epoxy out flat and thin, which will increase your working time on epoxy. If you leave it in the cup, it's going to heat up quicker when the 2 parts combine, and you're going to lose some of your working time. Now, I typically don't use them that often unless I'm doing multiple rods at once, because I fast enough that I get it done before the epoxy cooks, and then usually I'm waiting for the epoxy so I can do an epoxy ramp with a little thicker epoxy. So we've got it in our little paper plate here. It's spreading out. The bubbles are releasing. You can blow on it. The carbon dioxide in your breath and the heat will get the bubbles to release a little more. So all you need to do, and the trick I learned was you put it on heavy and then basically scrape off as much as you can. Now I've got it still in my wrapper here, but I've got the belt off so it's free spinning just like it would be in your stand. And we're gonna put it on thick and wipe it back off. Oop, I've got some extraneous bristles in my brush because I didn't check my brush. The other thing you need to do is always check your brush before you start, and that is going to irritate me. So I'm just going to clip that off. Perfect. Okay. All right, we're putting it on thick and we're going to scrape it back off. So I'm going to put it on. Pretty thick. Now if you didn't use color preserver, it would soak up a lot more. This is not going to soak up quite as much because the threads are already sealed with the CPX. So I've got it on thick here. Now I'm going to come back and I'm going to scrape it off. This is the first coat. This is where you're going to do multiple coats. You get a really flat look to your thread work, which makes it look very professional. There you go. That's the first two. Now I'll just move down here and get them all knocked out. Okay, I've got my first thin coat of epoxy on all of my thread work here. Now, while I have plenty of epoxy left over and plenty of time on this epoxy, this area that I sanded, I'm going to put down another thin layer of clear and get ready for labels, which we will do next time. I'm just getting it on heavy. I'm going to scrape it back off for the most part. I'm getting a nice even coat. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn this blank, keeping my brush in contact with it and making sure I've got a nice even coat all down the blank. A little extra there. Pull that off. And this area will be where I put my labels. One of the areas. And I've got a good coat on my blank. It's spread out fairly evenly. Now I just want to brush those marks out. So when I put it in dry mode, it will fall around the blank and make a nice smooth, even coat for the labels to stick to. You won't have any irregularities underneath your label because they will show up sometimes. Okay, that area is done. Now work on this big area. Plenty of time still on my epoxy, still very wet and runny. Now you can see where I sanded it with the sanding block, and what you're looking at, what looks white is actually just scratches catching the light. And when you get another coat of epoxy on it, the new epoxy fills in the scratches, so it'll be nice and clear and shiny again. Okay, got plenty on the blank. It's time to flatten it. And I'm barely touching the epoxy with this brush. Trying to leave the epoxy there, just take out the humps and the ridges. And there we go. Okay, that's epoxy. Now the only thing left to do is put a little heat on this. I use a heat gun quite a bit. I'm going to use the little flamethrower here this time. Maybe. This will get all the final little air bubbles out and get it to run nice and smooth around the blank. Put it in dryer mode here. Got my hand behind it just to know for sure how much heat I'm putting on this epoxy, because you don't want to cook the epoxy. It looks good. We'll hit all of these real quick. Although I don't have a lot of epoxy left on them because I put it on, scraped most of it off. I just want to knock any air bubbles out that may have shown up. There we go. That's it for epoxy over your guide wraps. We're going to let this cure, and then next time we'll put labels on it and the finished coat of epoxy. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you next time. Oh, if you're still watching, you get a bonus. I just dropped a little of the marbling mud, this purple color, the purple pinkish color, in the leftover epoxy here that's starting to set up. I mix it up really good with my brush. And now I'm going to making a mess with it. I'm going to do an epoxy ramp. And what I'm doing here is I'm just dripping it where I want this ramp to go. I'm using my brush to drag it. I'm not really brushing it. I'm just dragging it around the blank. One little pocket there I got to fill in. There is a marbled epoxy ramp. It's marvelous. Thanks for sticking around to the very end, guys. I will definitely see you next time.